All right, folks. Thank you so much for joining me here today. As you can see from the very prominent visuals behind me here, we're going to be covering a talk about creating characters with narrative appeal. So, who am I? If you're not familiar with me, I am an art director, concept artist, and illustrator with nearly 15 years experience in the games industry. I got my start on RuneScape at Jagex. And since then, I've worked on all kinds of different things, everything from Fable to Everwild to the Forza Horizon Racing series. But throughout the kind of varied things I've covered in my career, characters are my passion, and very specifically characters with story. And I think it's really important that when we're designing characters for games, that we think about what kind of story they tell and how they tell it. So why narrative appeal very specifically? Why not just a talk about how to create good characters? And it comes down to the fact that story is a fundamental part of human history. We spent most of our time before records were written down kind of passing on our history through story and through, other mediums like dance and all that sort of stuff. But ultimately, all of those forms of expression are usually stories that we use to kind of pass on things to other people. And people have an innate interest in other people's lives and stories. I was giving another slightly different talk about composition to an internal team the other day. And one of the things I was trying to get across to people was that when you put something in an image, in a composition, it can be the biggest, most impressive looking, different thing anyone's ever seen in the world. But the minute you put people in it, everybody goes, ooh, what are the people doing? And it's just an innate thing in us that we want to know about other people and how what we do relates to what they're doing and vice versa. And ultimately, how we present ourselves tells our stories to those around us. So best will in the world, every time you come across someone new, you're all sitting in this room looking at me, you're going to have made potential judgments about me based on how I dress, based on how I look, how I'm holding myself, how I present myself. And that's natural. Like, that's how we do it with everything. And I think that translates into how we design characters for video games, even if they're, really abstract characters like, the sort of hero of Journey, all the way up to the sort of much more realistic kind of relatable modern day kind of heroes in video games as well. So how do I create story in my characters? So these are the kind of things that we'll be covering in the talk today. So research and mood boards, pretty fundamental part of any kind of stage of character design is understanding what references you are pulling from. Design considerations, honestly, this could be a talk just in and of itself. And I appreciate that there might be many folks in the room when I get to that page who want way more detail on that particular slide. But this is a sort of overall look at how I create characters, especially when I don't necessarily have a huge amount of brief to work with. We've got word association. So language is a big part of how I create characters and how I interact with other teams who may not be as visually able as I am or don't have the brain to kind of think of things visually in the same way that I do. Posing questions, that's not a chance for you to ask questions. That's much more about how we pose characters. And then personality versus purpose, which I think is quite a key thing in when we design characters and the clothing they wear and how they wear them. And then appeal, which is something that I think a lot of people kind of overlook in favor of what they think is cool. And sometimes when you're designing games, depending on what kind of audience you want to, appeal to, there are different things that might conflict with what you particularly think is cool. If you're working in the right space, doing the right kind of game, hopefully those two things match up, but sometimes they don't. So let's jump into it. Research and mood boards. So how do I go about doing research and mood boards? So this is really important for me, and this is often one of the things that takes the most time. Most people, when they want to get to creating characters, they jump right into it because it's like, oh, I want to start drawing things, or I want to start like putting some ideas together. But actually, research and mood boards are one of my most important stages of creation. So I keep a key inspiration image mood board. And this image will be or this mood board would be sort of 20 to 30 images, absolute most. And the idea is that mood board forms the sort of core visual path that I want to take with creating a character, something that I can keep coming back to over and over, especially over development cycles that might take, 2 to 3 years of finding like a core character design. I also keep a secondary bit of everything board. So alongside these kind of key mood boards, I also keep a lot of other images. And this is the one that you would kind of associate, I suspect, with most artists, where you run past their page and there's just a giant pure F-board on the other side, full of hundreds of images that are much more about the specific smaller details of things. So work with your gut and be aware of your biases. It's my belief that most of us are in this industry because we're passionate about what we do. I see a lot of people who work, especially around character designs, who kind of ignore what they think is cool because they've been told that someone else thinks something else is cool. And I'm a big believer that passion shines through. When you're doing something that you really believe in and that you are passionate about, when you are, as Ian McCaig once put it to me, draw something you'd run naked in the snow to see. And I very much believe in that people should be we should be creating the games we'd run naked in the snow to see. But also be aware of your biases. The example I use is that everybody has a favorite color and usually a color that they can't stand. I personally hate what I call monster green, which is that very lush, vibrant grass green color. I hate it. But if I was creating a character that was like all about being bubbly in a forest and wanted to wear bright colors and blend in with the nature, maybe monster green is exactly the color I should be using. So just be aware of the things that you think are cool and then work with those things as much as you can, but be aware that sometimes your audience might want something different. And then think sideways and research if you have the time. I'm sure most of you can appreciate that development sometimes doesn't allow us the time we'd like to do things properly. But wherever I can, I like to jump down rabbit holes and do research and figure out how things are made or why things are called the things they are, whether it's the cuts of clothing or the materials, blacksmithing, all of these things that are quite relevant to character design. So I put a couple of examples together just to show you what my key inspiration boards might look like and a brief kind of character overview of what that character is. So this might be a sort of mood board for an African ruler. And for the most part, if someone was to come to you and say, hey, I want a character, he's an African ruler, he's really cool, most people would probably dive into the sort of fairly obvious African influences, which is no bad thing. I'm a great believer that I like to work in threes, and I think out of those things, 2 of them should be very familiar, and then 1 should be not familiar to the thing that you're designing. So in this particular instance, I've kind of looked at tribal makeup, tribal clothing styles, but then I kind of started asking, what would it look like if I took the Ming Dynasty era and put African influences through how the Ming Dynasty era used to dress? So lots of and that isn't to say that suddenly, you'd end up with lots of African kings wearing Chinese clothing, but what if they layered it in the same way? What if it was all about full body coverage? And then you start ending up in this place, which is a really interesting story because it's something that's familiar to people, but it just adds that little bit of oh, hang on, I haven't seen that before. That's a really interesting take on things. This particular character I fleshed out a little bit more. So again, trying to kind of appeal to a broader range as possible. So cyberpunk nightclub owner. And what was really interesting with this board was I started off with the kind of couture fashion and I kind of added the influence of the praying mantis afterwards. And the more I looked, the more I realized there was some really nice kind of overlaps in those spaces. So for example, the lady you see at the bottom in the red, just those shoulders already looking like mantis, praying mantis eyes. And I love when I start finding synergies. And I think you only do that when you do these early parts of research and you don't just jump into it. And then just as a third example, so this one, again, all 3 of these, if I was creating these characters, these would be my core key mood boards. These would be the things I'd keep coming back to make sure that I wasn't veering too far off the path that I'd set myself right at the very beginning. Because best one in the world, like I said, if you're designing for a really long time, it can sometimes be really easy to get bored of what you're looking at and forget that actually when your audience sees this, they're seeing it for the first time and that there might be a reason you were really pulled to these things or these images in the first place. So it acts as a really good kind of grounding stone to sort of keep your visual ideas on track. So design considerations. Are you making conscious choices? This is a question I ask around almost every facet of art, especially as an art director now, sort of guiding other teams, is are you just doing something because, or is there a reason you're doing it? And if there's a reason you're doing it, are you picking the right things to ensure that you are telling your audience there's a reason you're doing it? Do you want to subvert expectations? So do you want to lean into the really obvious, or do you want to kind of make the audience think one thing and then throw it on their head and turn something else, into something else? So, the example would be, you see a bright white shining knight and it turns out he's the big bad evil guy, And again, these are all considerations to be made within a sort of wider scope of whatever kind of game you're making. And then not everything has to be complicated. This one's probably very specifically for the narrative people and the concept artists in the room, because we love making things complicated. There is nothing a concept artist loves more than finding the most complicated way to do something, because it makes brain go brr. But honestly, sometimes simplicity is the best answer. And if there's a thing staring you in the face and you're kind of avoiding it because it's been staring in your face, sometimes it's the right answer. So like I said, this is probably the thing where, you know, if you've ever had a kind of more technical talk about how to design characters, this is the stuff that will probably be more familiar to you. This could be an entire 2-hour talk in and of itself, so I'm going to gloss over these pretty quickly. But basically, when you're considering character design, shape, value, and color are kind of the 3 principles that I'm always considering whenever I'm designing characters. So shape is that immediate first read you get on almost everything. Value is the way we break up those shapes and get a clear read within that particular shape. And then color is the thing that I think often adds emotion to something. So, you know, best will in the world, even though we all have our own preferences, there are certain commonalities with certain value designs. So things that are light tend to have a certain association. Things that are dark tend to have a certain association. And being aware of these and how they can affect how somebody reads into a story of a character is really key. And I think color is one of those things that does this very, very strongly. If you want to learn more about shape, I would absolutely advise you to go look into animation viz dev. They are geniuses at this, and especially Pixar. You know, any kind of Pixar viz dev book will be full of things that are absolutely emotive in terms of the shapes that they use. And while not everybody is working on the kind of stylized games that would benefit from that, it still feeds into a lot of the design choices we make. If you've ever seen the art book of Dragon Age, for example, they leaned into a lot of that kind of very basic shape language with a lot of their character designs, even though the character designs are very, you know, realistic and relatable in terms of proportions and materials and all of that sort of stuff. But because a lot of these shapes have particular associations with them, certain emotional associations in the same way that colors do, you know, that might be something you want to lean into. Again, whether you're making a deliberate choice to be like, well, he's the stoic, short, angry guy, so of course he's going to be a square, but maybe you want to subvert someone's expectations and it actually turns out he's the lovable, cuddly guy, and you just want to make people think that he's not the lovable, cuddly guy. Value is, again, something I could talk on for hours at a time, but basically, like, just be aware of how you're breaking things up and what you're calling attention to in a character. Oftentimes, areas of great contrast will pull focus from areas of non-great contrast. So when you're designing clothing or armor or whatever it happens to be around your character, be aware of where you're putting contrast, because it can make people focus on things, especially if you're not making conscious decisions. So word association, not a fun game, but like I say, you know, if I hadn't gone into art, I think I'd have gone into some form of, I don't know, etymology career, because I find language almost as fascinating as I do art. So words are really big for me. It's how I communicate, not just with the art team, but also with, like I said, teams outside of art who aren't necessarily artistically minded. When I'm trying to decide how I'm going to create characters, I often focus on words to help me do that. So when I'm considering the kind of words I'm thinking of, I'm thinking about what kind of product I'm designing for and what my audience's expectations are and how obvious my design needs to be. So again, this kind of comes into this making conscious choices thing, which I will repeat multiple times during this talk. But just be aware of what kind of product you're designing for and what your audience's expectations are. It's not wrong or right to lean into your audience's expectations or to try and subvert them. Just be aware of what you're doing. So, for example, you know, there are plenty of games out there that lean into the kind of good and bad. And when you're using words like good and light and sweet and pure and innocent, like there are certain, especially in Western audiences, and I'm very aware that in certain other cultures, white may have a very different cultural, you know, expectation. And again, that's where the research comes into it when we're talking about mood boards and that sort of thing. Just be aware of what your audience's expectations are. But, you know, in Western circles, certainly if you use these kind of words, these are probably the kind of images and the kind of characters that spring to mind. And again, just because they're well-trodden characters doesn't necessarily mean they're wrong. If you need someone who is like the embodiment of purity in your game, then maybe these are the kind of designs you need to be looking at, and these are the kind of words you need to be considering. Vice versa, you know, you know, if you've played Diablo recently, you know, they really lean into, like, Diablo's a great example of a game that's just gone, yeah, we are all about good and evil and all the bits in between, and leaning into all of the shape and narrative design to get that across to our players. But sometimes, and I think quite a lot of the time, actually, you know, games, especially now as we move into sort of a space where they're so accessible to everybody, and the tools that we use to make them are allowing smaller teams to create more immersive experiences, that this space in between is the really interesting one for me. And this is where I spend most of my time when I'm creating characters, unless I've very specifically been told that we need one of those like very extreme examples, like in the pure and evil kind of sense. I love finding new words to describe things, because if you look at the words I've particularly chosen to describe these characters, you know, stoic is not the same as quiet. Someone who is quiet is not the same as someone who is stoic. And paying attention to those particular differences in words can start giving your characters a real sense of personality that transcends just, oh, she's cute, or she's kooky, or she's whatever. You know, so I really love trying to find, like, I spend quite a lot of time on thesaurus.com just having a bounce around some words and trying to figure out, like, what is a good word to describe the kind of character, and what specifically is it about that word that nails down the kind of character I'm trying to, you know, to create. If any of you are familiar with so all of these are my personal work characters. If any of you are familiar with the Whaler Girl, you know that, like, a lot of my characters have quite various kind of looks, and I've leaned into the various personalities of them. So this word association thing is really important to me for differentiating my different characters, how they stand, how they dress, how they choose to kind of clothe themselves. So on the note of kind of posing, so this is a really good example, and this is why I kind of went into the word thing first, right? So when I was working at Atom Hawk, we had a bit of downtime, and in our downtime at Atom Hawk, we basically got to kind of work on projects that would kind of teach other artists that came on board about how we did our particular thing. So I put together a brief for a death priestess, and the only kind of thing I gave myself was a single sentence of, like, she was a death priestess in a kind of gothic horror game using the colors white, black, and red, and that was it. And the whole point was that a lot of the times working in this industry as a concept artist, those are the kind of briefs I get. It would be great if we could get perfect in-depth narrative briefs for every character we get. More than likely the narrative team, if you even have one, is usually full to their eyeballs of doing all the other stuff. So they're like, yeah, here's an NPC, he wears blue and white, and he's kind of cranky, go for your life. So this is where the word thing comes in, right? And I'm a big proponent of, if you can get character in your characters before you put faces, hair, and clothes on them, you battle's halfway won, right? So this is why posing is so important to me when I'm creating characters and thinking about how they stand, how they hold themselves. You know, all of these words along the bottom here have quite different meanings and could end up in quite a different feeling character, even though they've all come from the same kind of base brief of kind of death priestess, essentially. So, you know, pious is very different to kind of iconic. And when I say the word iconic, I mean it more in the sense of religious iconography. You know, mystical is very different to delicate. And all of these things start telling different stories about what kind of death priestess, you know, this is. Is this a very aggressive death priestess who will literally kill you as you walk by? Or actually, is she more of a guardian's, you know, sort of soul, helping people pass to the other side and being peace? So oftentimes when you're kind of given, you know, briefs or asked to do these kind of characters, it's worth having a kind of think. And I found this, like I said, really useful for kind of dealing with non-art departments very specifically, because it gives everybody, like, everybody understands words, hopefully. Sometimes, not always. But you can have, at least it starts the conversation, and it gets people thinking about how this works. And I love doing this with my thumbnails. Like, this is my thumbnail process almost all of the time. So I kind of go, okay, what kind of range of emotions do I want my character to have? And then I start just purely with the poses. So I am not afraid to steal what I need. I see this a lot especially in younger students and people who need a bit more guidance in their career. They believe you have to be able to do everything from scratch. You know, I'm, like I say, 15, 20 years into my career at this point, I still trace over references. I think as long as you're not, you know, translating it one for one, if you can pay for reference packs, like all of these were taken from the now dead section of DeviantArt's stock. If any of you are ever browsed DeviantArt, I don't recommend it now. It's weird. Ooh, yeah, no. But yeah, like even places like ArtStation now have some of the most amazing photographers putting really useful packs together that are specifically aimed at people who work in entertainment fields. You know, people with swords, people with axes, people with guns, people with all these kind of different things. And even though I'm kind of obviously showing references that would work for obviously a very realistic game, even when I'm doing more stylized stuff, I try to start from something that's real and believable and then exaggerate it if I need to. So I love finding kind of interesting looking poses. It's where I spend a lot of my time. Like realistically, when I'm kind of creating characters, it's probably like, I don't know, like 30% of the time, if 100% of my time is start to finish, like 30% of my time is usually looking up references, looking up images, trying to find like a good starting point. And it's very much, I like to use the kind of sharpening my axe analogy, if any of you have heard that, where if you just run at the tree without sharpening your axe and hack away at it for hours and hours and hours on end, you're going to eventually dull the blade, and it's going to take you far, far longer to get the tree down than if occasionally you just stop and sharpen the blade. And that's kind of what I consider reference hunting to be doing. And it's not just poses, it'll be details in costumes and all of that sort of stuff as well. So you can see there, it's not a one-to-one comparison. I've probably kind of hacked other images together, which is something I quite like doing. But again, like reference is key if you want things to be believable and relatable. So you remember Syra back from the mood board things. So this is how I started her kind of thumbnail page. Again, trying to find poses. I was looking at different body types as well. Generally, when I'm doing thumbnails, if I don't have a very specific brief that tells me they need to be a specific body type or a specific ethnicity, I will try my best to kind of get as many different variations in there that I'm not kind of just relying on the first thing that comes to mind and sticking with it. Thumbnails are always a chance for me to kind of explore as wide a variation as I can, especially in the early stages of development where, you know, there are no wrong or right answers to anything. Usually it's a conversation starter. So from there, you end up with a kind of page of thumbnails. And even though there's only 3 poses in there, I think you end up with quite a lot of variation. And they all have quite different feeling personalities. Again, coming back to this idea that you've started with this one brief that she is this, you know, cool cyberpunk nightclub owner who goes by the name Mantis, and she's inspired by couture fashion and praying mantises, and that's it. And that I really try and find like the outer edges of what I can do with that, whether it's, you know, headphones that look like praying mantis eyes or actually physical masks that look like praying mantises. I'm trying to find as many different ways to kind of interpret those design cues and think about what kind of personality these people have. Like, even again, within these, there were probably words. It's a while since I did this, so you'll forgive me if I don't remember them. But there were loads of words I used to kind of come up with different variations. Was she shy and retiring? Was she bombastic? Did she love getting on the dance floor? Was she more of a sort of trader of information who hid her identity and all of that sort of stuff? And all of these kind of characters would have had that kind of thinking behind them rather than just, oh, I'm going to draw one with a yellow thing on it, or I'm going to draw one with a black thing on it. You know, when I'm considering whether I want to say something about how, you know, extroverted or introverted someone is, I'm considering the kind of body language and shape language and all of that sort of stuff along with it. So purpose versus personality. So purpose is essentially, what does it do? This is fairly straightforward for most things. But I think a lot of the time we tend to think of purpose as just, okay, it has a physical reason for being in the game. So it's a grappling hook, or it's a gun holster, or it's the scabbard of a sword, which is the sore point of my life as a concept artist, because I hate designing where to put scabbards because it ruins all the really nice designs I do. But, you know, it's all about purpose, but there's lots of different purposes, you know, not just, okay, it keeps something somewhere. Sometimes purpose can just be, it's a personal memory. Sometimes purpose can be showing danger or showing safety. And that doesn't necessarily mean someone wearing like a high-vis jacket or something like that. If you think about NPCs you engage in I don't know, like I talk about fantasy a lot because that's the kind of genre that I move in and I love. But, you know, again, the Death Priestess, is she a danger to you, or is she a place of safe passage for you? Those sorts of things should be, you know, informing what kind of design decisions you make as part of your kind of game. And again, even if you think about something like Journey, which is quite abstract, like the character designs in that, the shapes they use, the flow and the motion of the kind of cloth and the sort of friendliness, there's nothing in that game that's overly dark or sharp or, you know, and realistically, you know, none of the stuff it has really has any purpose other than that its purpose is to add to the kind of flow of the game and the feel of the game moment to moment. So sometimes purpose isn't necessarily, does it have a thing associated with it, or can you put a sword in it, or does it hold a gun? You know, sometimes purpose is just, you know, showing your interests. You know, are you designing a character that's into a certain fandom? How could you show that? Like, that's part of that character's story. And then on top of that, so the purpose is usually the obvious thing and the thing that most people think about when they're designing characters. But personality is something I see much less in a lot of character designs. And I think this comes down to a lot of the time how things are designed in games. So, you know, we talk about designing things so that other people can make them. But again, when I'm designing characters and I'm trying to get people on board with what we're doing, I really try and think about, even if it ends up looking slightly different in the final game, I'll be thinking about how someone wears something. And I think that's something that I don't see a lot of in games is, oh, okay, they're wearing jeans. Well, how many people in this room are wearing jeans or wearing shorts, and how are you wearing them is probably quite different to everyone else in the room, right? Because it's a personal decision about how you present yourself and how you like to dress, whether you want to be comfortable, whether you want to be high fashion, whether you want to make a statement, whether you want to blend in, whether you want to stand out, all of those kind of things. So I think it's a really interesting thing that doesn't get kind of covered as much in especially in narrative kind of character design. So you can see, like, in the bottom left-hand side, like, woman in a yellow dress at an award ceremony. Both of those dresses are long and yellow, but they're worn in quite different ways and say quite different things, even though they are quite similar women wearing them in a very similar, you know, setting. You know, one gives a certain level of, you know, sexy confidence off, and the other is more a sort of statement piece about the dress itself. And again, sometimes this comes down to kind of breaking a sense of believability as well. So, you know, if you take the sort of anime lady in the armor in the middle at the bottom there, realistically, a metal headband would be the worst thing in the world to wear, because it's not really going to do anything and honestly be horribly uncomfortable. But you know, as a choice, if you want a knight and you're trying to find a way to tell people that she's a little softer, she's not like badass and hard ass. Not only do the white flowing sleeves, again, we come back to this idea of sort of more sweet and innocent and, you know, flowy, but that headband is a choice to make you think a particular way about what kind of character is under that armor. Same thing goes for sort of, if any of you are fans of Critical Role, I love their character designs because they really seem to think about how their characters would wear things, little trinkets that they might have on them from previous journeys, you know, icons on them, all of that sort of stuff. So it's worth considering all of these things when you're kind of thinking about how to design characters and what kind of story you want to tell with those characters. You know, even when it comes down to things like in places like prisons, for example, where everybody's wearing the same thing, you'll get a sense of who that prisoner is based on how they're wearing their outfit, right? It's really, you know, do they just chuck it off at the top and wander around half naked? I mean, they're in women's prison. I mean, more power to you. You know, and all of these things kind of, there's a reason I kind of spend a little time on this slide, because it's one of those things that I'm really, really thinking about when I put character designs together and I'm trying to tell stories. I'm thinking about everything I put on the character, what place it has in the world and what place it has on that character, and then what that says to my audience. When my audience are looking at a character, do they get a sense of who this person is? And usually it's because I'm blending both of these things. There's usually a purpose to something, and then there's usually a bit of personality to how it's worn. So audience appeal, like I said, this is the one that sometimes gets a little kind of overlooked. And it's one of the things that's the most difficult to capture sometimes. So not everything has to be new. Cliches work for a reason. Red-headed pirate chicks, which are my jam. That's what the lead character in my own world is. I love redheads. I love pirates. But, you know, there's a lot of red-headed pirates out there. So it kind of has to be new also. And this is where that sort of, I talked about that idea of kind of working in threes, where you find a couple of things that are familiar and then you throw in the unexpected. So that can just be, you know, Gorgon pirates, as Magic the Gathering has on the right-hand side here. With me, when I was looking to kind of create my, my main character, which is the lady you see there on the left, I really wanted something that still felt very pirate and very kind of Corsair-esque, looks like it kind of belongs in a sort of high fantasy world. Realistically, the purpose of her clothing is much less important than the way she's wearing it and what she's choosing to wear. Because honestly, like that brocaded corset running around on a ship with salt and water that's not going to last. That's going to have worn away in like a few days, quite frankly. But she has a particular place in her world that is quite feminine. So I want to kind of get that across in the design that she's wearing. The lace was a particular choice based on the fact that all of the women in this particular world, in this particular station who kind of align themselves with the more male kind of pirates, all wear lace as almost like a sign of their femininity and embracing it. And then there's some practicality, like I didn't put her in a long skirt because I was like, that's kind of the, you know, the outer edge of believable. Running around on a, you know, in the middle of rigging with a long skirt on would just be stupid. So yeah, putting her in pants is a kind of nod to like, hey, I'm going to make her somewhat practical. But I really wanted to blend something of the Western culture of pirates. I looked into a lot of the kind of North African Amazigh people. And looking at the sort of influence that they've had in Moorish pirates and that sort of thing, blending a little bit of that. And then the unexpected was me kind of going, where else are skulls used in the world? Because kind of skulls and pirates are pretty much like a given thing, right? Like it's, you know, skull and crossbones. And I started kind of playing around with the idea of kind of bringing in a little bit of the almost like Day of the Dead kind of style of skulls. So, but trying to blend it in a way where I'm not just going, okay, everybody gets to paint the kind of, you know, sugar candy skull pattern on their face, but like if I was going to do that and translate it through that filter of real world pirate, what would that look like and what would that feel like? So in this particular world, they take actual human skulls, break them down, turn them into masks, and then decorate them afterwards. So it's this, they're very much seen as the kind of, you know, devils of the sea, so to speak. So they're leaning into that thing, and some of them have horns attached to their skulls and all of that sort of fun stuff. So that's kind of an example of me kind of going Western pirates, a little bit of Northern Moorish pirate influence, and then the Day of the Dead was the kind of out there, slightly different thing I've kind of thrown in to make people go, oh, that feels familiar, but like I haven't quite seen it done in that way before. So all of these things, all of the images on this page have something about them that is a bit sort of, oh, I haven't seen it done like that. Sea of Thieves is about as like on the nose pirate design as you can possibly get. Like they're all wearing, you know, pirate hats and eye patches and torn vests and all of that sort of stuff. But the style is the thing that makes it stand out, because up until that point, most pirates in games were very beautiful people. And I loved Sea of Thieves for coming out with like these gnarly old like granddad pirates is like the coolest thing in the world to me. And my partner and I both ran around in Sea of Thieves the longest time as like these two old man and woman pirates. And if anyone got close to us on voice comms, we'd be like, well, hello there, Sonny, how are you? Nerds, I know. But yeah, even the sort of, you know, the pirate in the bottom middle, which is, you know, again, leaning into a lot of very typical pirate fantasy things. The fact that that particular artist decided to use their mom as a model is just really cool, because again, you don't get to see that. Maybe I'm being ageist here, I don't know. But you don't get to see that many kind of cool, badass, older, especially older women pirates. Like you see badass older dude pirates all the time, but yeah, older badass women pirates is a bit different. So technical ability, this is the other thing. And I'm a great believer that technical ability is probably one of the things that is most easily taught. And I don't think you should spend like a huge amount of time looking for someone who's like, if I have two candidates applying for a job and one of them has awesome ideas and the other one is slightly more technically proficient, but their ideas aren't as awesome, I'll take the guy who has the awesome ideas any day of the week. I'm much more about somebody who can come up with new ideas and come up with different ways of thinking. And I can teach someone how to render materials. I can teach someone how to photo bash things. I can teach someone how to use 3D. And the problem is, you know, technical ability makes your designs relatable to other people, whether you're using super realistic characters or really kind of stylized sort of abstract characters. That technical ability is what makes people stop looking at the thing you've drawn and the brushstrokes you've made, and makes you concentrate on the kind of cool character within that design. And when you don't have technical ability, you kind of end up with scours and sanitary pads. So in summary, and we should have about 10 minutes to kind of cover questions, which is good. So in summary, just because you think something's cool or not doesn't necessarily mean your audience won't think differently. I'm guilty of this myself. I get very caught up in what I think is cool. And in an ideal world, we all make games for the audience that is us. But that's not always the case. Sometimes you're making games for the audience that isn't you. So being, again, that whole follow your gut, but be aware of your biases thing is really important. And then there's just a number of kind of questions that I tend to ask myself when I'm designing characters and thinking about the story that they convey is, what is your player fantasy? Whether you're designing, the next player character for, Apex Legends or Warcraft or Diablo, what is it that your audience wants out of that character? What kind of stories do the people who play those games want to tell with the kind of characters you're putting in? What do people associate, with when it comes to NPCs? A lot of games have a huge following because people really hook into the stories of the NPCs that they've got in that game. What are the key visual design elements? So that comes back to your shape, your color, and your value. And are you making the right choices around what the player fantasy is and what you're doing narratively? Where does it make sense to inject the unexpected? So within that rule of 3, sometimes you might want to not put that third thing in because you want to be really on the nose and be like, hey, this game is this, and like, look at it. If I wanted to make a game that was all about pirates, and I was like, I don't want people to be like, wait, is that a pirate? Like, I'm going to lean in fully with the whole peg leg, pirate hat, parrot on the shoulder, all of that sort of stuff. I try and find something a little bit unique, whether it's palette or materials, or maybe throwing a little bit of story into someone who might choose to be like that on the nose pirate. But it's worth considering where it makes sense to inject the unexpected. And then are your fundamentals up to the task? So if you are an artist and you are doing this, be aware sometimes that, the things we want to do might be slightly out of our grasp. And for me, it's a summitless mountain, like I am always learning how to get better, whether that's learning new software or revisiting my fundamentals in order to make sure that, if I'm making and I'm creating characters, that they have that feel and narrative, and that I'm getting the story across in a way that doesn't make people stop and go, is that ear supposed to be there? Because there's nothing that will ruin the appeal of a character more than somebody's facial features being off, or their proportions being off. And it's what most kind of students and that sort of thing fall afoul of, because they're so keen to get to the cool design stuff that they don't learn how to kind of translate the cool designs in their head. So most people will look at kind of younger, sort of especially beginners in the industry. A lot of the time, if the work's not working, it's usually because the fundamentals are kind of lacking. So yes, thank you so much for listening. We've got like 7 minutes left, not bad. We do have a microphone at the back of the room. If anybody would like to ask questions, please grab the microphone. There is also, I believe, a survey sent out as part of this talk. If you guys would be kind enough to kind of fill in that survey, let people know if you enjoyed the talk, that sort of thing. It helps develop, kind of get more people like myself in to talk about these kind of cool things. So yeah, thank you so much. Any questions?
Hiya, thank you very much for your talk.
You're welcome.
For someone who's looking for a freelance concept artist, how much information should, or how detailed should the brief be? Like, because I guess there's one end of the spectrum where it's too detailed, where I guess it's not allowing for creative control or decisions.
Yeah.
And the other side is it's maybe not detailed enough to understand, what the thing is to create. Like, what's the good medium, I guess?
I think it's almost like if you look at how we broke up the mood board thing in the beginning, right? Like, if you want a brief, like my generally when we're sending briefs to kind of outsourcers and that sort of thing, and we're kind of putting stuff together like that, we'll have like a core like paragraph or two that's about like, here is the absolute core of the character, this is what we need in this character design, or this is what we need even in environment designs as well, right, where it's like, here are the words I want to use, here's the descriptors, you know, he's aggressive and he's a bit of a scourge of the sea and he doesn't stop attacking people, and it's all about like forward momentum. And then there might be like, he needs to be dressed in like dark punk clothing, and then that's usually where I leave it. And then if you want to put extra information, leave it up to the artist if they need that extra information. Because sometimes if you get too specific, it depends on the artists you're using, right? If you're looking at someone who's got a lot of experience like myself, like I need very little to kind of come up with cool ideas. And I generally will have an understanding of what the audience is looking for and what the client is looking for. Sometimes if you're working with less tested kind of concept artists, I would say then err on the side of putting a little more information in, because oftentimes you're basically giving them a little more kind of information to work with and base their references on and that sort of thing. So I work slightly differently with the different artists on my team. So the more senior ones, I know I can go in and be like, oh, hey, I need a building design, it's got a roof. Off you go. Whereas with the juniors, it might be more, hey, I need a building design. It needs to house 4 people. It needs to have 2 entrances. It needs to be made of this material, this, that, and the other. So it's very much like having an understanding of where the skill set of the artist sort of sits. And generally, you'll get a good sense of that. Like, you know, usually I would hope from their portfolio and their experience, kind of taking those 2 things in tandem. But generally, if in doubt, err on the side of caution and give them as much information as you can, but be, you know, I would also kind of add the caveat of like, hey, if you have any other cool ideas outside of this very specific information I've given you, like throw a couple of those in, because that's sometimes where the really interesting stuff comes in. Because best will in the world, like artists' brains work slightly differently to, you know, designers' brains and that sort of thing. And I would give a design to a character design to a combat specialist, and they might come up with something I had absolutely not thought of based on that kind of physical design. So just be open to the kind of speciality of the artist essentially as well.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. We got one first.
Hi, thank you. It's just disappeared out of my brain. For someone developing their own IP or looking to develop their own IP, what advice would you give them?
Oh God.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, that's a big one, and we've got 3 minutes, so thank you for that. My own IP started with just a character. I wasn't planning. I didn't go, I'm going to build a huge world with like loads of characters and cool places. Again, nerd alert. It started because I was role playing with a couple of friends online, and we needed like a standing character to just ship one character to another place. And from there, it was just like one of those things where within about 3 paragraphs of text that I'd written, I was like, I fucking love this character. I need to do something more with her. And then from there, it was just like, it's taken me like 10 years to build the IP I've got with the Whaler Girl, and it's not finished by a long shot. And I think my advice would be, don't aim for perfection right out the gate. Don't expect to get everything sorted, because if you spend all your time planning towards that like final goal of, well, I want to get all my cities designed and all my characters like written out, you'll never get it done. Do it a bit at a time. Like I've developed this world because I've kind of gone, well, I've got this character. Who's her dad? I'm going to design a dad. Great. Hey, I've got a dad. Wait, what does a dad do? What if he was a whaler? That's cool. And then it's like, suddenly it was like, I had what was a kind of pirate chick, like the red-headed pirate that I showed you. There was a bunch of thumbnails. Those were my original designs for my main character. Very, very on the nose, like cute, sexy pirate chick, red curly hair, all of that sort of stuff. But it wasn't until I started going, okay, what does her dad do? And then it was like, oh, what if her dad was a whaler and she lived in this? And it's all very like, I'm a big proponent of building on your own experience as well. So a lot of the Whaler Girl is based around the fact that I grew up in the north near the sort of northern English coast. So if you go and look at the kind of the place she grew up in, it's kind of that, but with like a little bit of kind of, I guess, a little bit of kind of Inuit culture thrown in there as well, like imagined in an even colder climate with more extremes and that sort of thing. And the fact that my kind of pirate culture is set in a very Mediterranean looking space is also not a coincidence, because that's a place I love being. Like I'm an absolute lizard. I love being sunny places and warm places. So yeah, my advice would be, start small and build out, and work with the things that you love and you know.
Cool, thank you.
We got time for one more? We're good. All right. No, I'm being given the no signal from the back. So I really appreciate you all being here. Thank you so much.